Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Big updates coming out of Ted Kravitz that Red Bull are going to be nigh on unbeatable going into the new season based on a combination of secret weapons they have in their pockets. The main one being their car is going to be underweight this season after a revolutionary new monocoque chassis they bring into their car. This means they can put ballast where they like it and potentially give them a significant edge, certainly at the start of the season. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. Testing begins very shortly indeed. There's a lot of drama actually about, well, from the drivers about this, especially George Russell, very frustrated about the fact that testing, there's not enough of it. Back in the day, you could test as much as you wanted. Just rock up to a track whenever you liked, just go there and test. Nowadays, it's so restricted. The teams are allowed to do this 100k shakedown. Then they, of course, go to testing this weekend and can have a car on track for about 8 hours a day for 3 days in a row, but only one car on track at a time. The drivers themselves only get about a day and a half of time in the car itself, which isn't exactly ideal. And even Russell says, I don't think 3 days is enough. Can you imagine Rafa Nadal spending weeks on hitting a ball and then going straight into the French Open? Now, okay, I'm not exactly sure this analysis or this kind of synonymy here that he's trying to create works particularly well, because Russell and Co can still, drive the car in the simulator type thing, but I agree with him in a sense that they're not allowed to drive the car as much as they could, and also getting all the testing they need to get done over those couple of days is pretty challenging to happen. And he says, yeah, this basically 3 days isn't enough is what he's getting at. But look, it's very expensive. There's additional costs involved to allow this to happen and to try and keep the teams on the same page. At least, look, every team has the same amount of testing time and they will have to use it to their advantage. Red Bull have confirmed their timings for the weekend as well, so Verstappen will be in the car on the entirety of Thursday and Friday afternoon, Perez at the wheel on Friday morning and the entirety of Saturday. So that is their plan, but lots of talk about Hamilton versus Verstappen this year and whether it'll be Verstappen joining a very exclusive club of back-to-back-to-back world champions. Certainly Verstappen and Red Bull will be favourites for it. Yes, they've got the cost cap penalty that's come into place, but I believe most people suggest, and I think makes sense as well, that a lot of these the issues they might suffer because of that, if there are any, will only happen down the line. This 10% reduction will not affect them immediately, especially because the RB19 was well into development anyway before that penalty even came into effect. So this is something that we might see come into effect of Red Bull towards the end of this season, maybe going into next season as well, but I don't think it will affect at all how competitive their car is at the start of this year. Even Craig Slater mentions in the clip I'm about to share that he reckoned that some mechanics from other teams and engineers have mentioned to him the Red Bull still have more to unlock in terms of pure aerodynamics, and it's not just aero where Red Bull are looking to make gains. Ted Kravitz, of course, we've known that he's had a fair bit of drama the last season or so with Red Bull, reckons that they're going to be almost unbeatable this season based on 3 key factors. The main one of which I would say being the developments to their car in terms of the lighter chassis. We heard last season, even around Spa, I think it was, they had in development an entirely new chassis that was going to be much lighter than the previous version. Turned out by the time they wanted to bring that in, they had hit the budget cap probably, although we don't exactly know yet, so they decided to wait for next year, and they'd already won both championships pretty much. They didn't even need their lighter chassis last year. They thought, you know what, let's just save it for 2023. This should unlock a fair bit of performance for free, as Mercedes and other teams will be able to do as well. And Ted Kravitz goes as far to say that it's actually underweight, as in it's lighter than what will total out as the 798 kilogram weight minimum limit, so therefore they can actually play around with ballast in the car, which will give them even more advantage.
But are they still so far ahead? With maybe actually 1 or 2 people who said to me, engineers from rival teams, they still think Red Bull will make gains as well, aerodynamically. So is it going to be a difficult job to catch them?
Red Bull will start with the lightweight chassis that they introduced and designed and made, we think, but never raced towards the end of the year. They'll start that as a base. They will have developed that, so it will be underweight, and they can ballast it up to meet the weight limit. Benefit 1. Benefit 2, they would have done all the aerodynamic work and design before the restrictions they had on their accepted breach agreement of the cost cap restrictions came in, their penalty for that. So they've done all the work before that even comes in. And 3,
next year
towards the end of this year, and next year it will start to bite. And number 3, they have the best driver on the grid in terms of form at the moment, even considering Lewis Hamilton. Lewis's form we haven't seen the championship form of Lewis yet because he hasn't been in a championship since the end of 2021, which we know what happened then. Max Verstappen is bang in form, and I think that is the third part of their secret weapon that should make them nigh on unbeatable.
So 3 things there really that Ted Kravitz mentions that will give them an advantage. As I say, the key one probably being the fact that it's going to be under the regulatory weight. That means they can do some additions down the line, some adjustments and some further developments that, okay, can bring it up to the weight limit, but will still be fine. Or, as I believe Alpine have said as well, that they are under the weight limit, therefore they can play around with, where they put weight in the car. They can play around with ballast, and if the car is balanced towards, it's like teams like Mercedes last year suffered immensely with car balance over the course of the year, which meant that the drivers were probably quicker than they could show just because they lacked a lot of confidence. I think we saw that quite often with Hamilton, certainly towards the start of the year, and even Russell at times, that the car was probably quicker than they could really extract because whenever they pushed it, it was just super unstable and they struggled to get the most out of it. So if they can play around with ballast, Red Bull, as seemingly they can, then they can, potentially deal with any of those problems and give themselves even more of an advantage. Of course, one of the other key advantages is Max Verstappen in the car at the end of the day, right? He obviously drove phenomenal last season, was the best driver by a margin, and we're not exactly expecting that to go away. So if Red Bull are competitive, Verstappen will be there in the fight, no question. I think the big question to me about Red Bull is the fact that many are predicting Verstappen to demolish Sergio Perez in the championship standings. Not exactly a massive surprise. What does that mean for the constructors? And what does that mean as well for potential support, right? This is always the question that I've got, is that if the Red Bull isn't by far the strongest car, and the Mercedes and the Ferrari are there with him, and Verstappen's P1 and Perez's P6, then, Verstappen's a big target for the other teams to get at via strategy and other potential issues like that. The other advantage that Honda and Red Bull have is their MGU-K. So there's 2 parts of the energy deployment side, the MGU-K and the MGU-H, and the MGU-K is the kinetic side. And man, Honda have been unreal at this for some time. Even I think Hamilton mentioned it specifically last season, that it feels like Red Bull have way more deployment in terms of battery power than the other teams are able to have. Certainly at circuits like, for example, I think Mexico, maybe Hamilton mentioned it specifically, that it felt like Verstappen had way more deployment in terms of battery than the other teams are able to achieve. So this is one advantage that Honda have seemed to carry for some time now, and is another clear advantage on the Red Bull powertrains, which is getting branded again as Honda this year, although they don't have the nice and sexy Honda rear wing they used to have. It looks disgusting nowadays with Bybit, whatever that is. I think it's one of the few crypto things that actually survived over these last few months. So few advantages that Red Bull are certainly going to have going into the new season that make them an absolute force. Now, it's not been all sunshine and rainbows around Red Bull, must be said. Verstappen has not been happy actually about the absurd, as he sees it, super license fee. So in Formula 1, the teams have to pay for, firstly they have to pay to enter, but the drivers themselves, based on their performance in the previous season, have to pay the FIA for their super licenses. So of course Verstappen, he's pretty good, right, this guy, so he's going to get his license, but he's still got to pay for it. I think he had to pay about $1 million just to compete in Formula 1 this year. And if you tally up the numbers across the entry fees across the teams, Williams had to pay under $1 million, AlphaTauri under $1 million, Haas under $1 million, but every other team paid between $1 million and, in Mercedes' case, almost $5 million, Ferrari over 5.2, and then Red Bull almost $8 million straight to the FIA just to enter the sport. So, this is another reason why I guess that maybe the FIA and Formula 1 and the teams and the bosses and the drivers don't exactly have the greatest relationship right now, and Verstappen obviously has not been happy about it at all, and you can understand why. I don't know if he has to pay that himself. I imagine the team will pay it for him, but nonetheless, a pretty big deal. Also, Verstappen, while we're on this topic, discussed the other day his ideal driver pairing in Formula 1. If he was the team principal or the team boss, which 2 drivers would he sign? Now, we know that Verstappen and Fernando Alonso get on very well indeed. I think they've mentioned in the past the willingness to do some endurance racing together in the future. So he says that, okay, if he was the team principal, he would get Fernando Alonso, an experienced one. Of course, didn't mention Hamilton, but it's pretty expected at this point. And then he would take a young guy, and I would put Lando in the car. So Nando and Lando in the same team. Honestly, that's a great driver pairing. I think Verstappen's made a good choice here, but it's quite interesting to see that out of the veteran drivers, Verstappen's favourite would be Fernando Alonso. Not really a massive surprise. And then out of the younger drivers, the likes of George Russell, Charles Leclerc, Lando Norris, and others, Lando is his pick, which is quite exciting as well about the prospects there. We even saw earlier today that McLaren and Red Bull are potentially considering some sort of engine partnership, and obviously Verstappen quite likes Lando Norris, so it does make you wonder whether in the future Sergio Perez, obviously not chosen by Verstappen in this instance, would get potentially replaced by a guy like Lando Norris, given the fact that Lando already talked about, and I think even Red Bull said, that they talked to Lando in the past to try and get him to join. It didn't happen. He stayed with McLaren. He might be regretting that decision this year, depending on how things go. And the final thing to mention for you guys, these are the compounds in play for this weekend's testing in Sakhir of course, the Bahrain Grand Prix circuit. So we're not expecting intermediates or wets to be necessary. There are plenty of compounds in use though. So last year there was the C1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. That goes from hardest for the C1 through to the C5, the softest. And on a normal race weekends, they will choose 3 of those tyres to represent either the hard, medium or soft. So one weekend it might be C1, C2, C3, and the C3 would be red for soft. Another weekend it might be C3, C4, C5. So the C3, the same tyre that was the soft the other weekends, will now be white as the hard tyre. That's just how it goes. Now this year there's more compounds. So they've brought in a new C1. The C0 was the old hard tyre that was the C1 from last year. That's now the C0. So there's a new hard tyre, the C1, that's white, and that's going to have the lines on it. And then you've got the C0, which is last year's C1 with white but no brackets on it, I guess they're calling it. Then the C2 is yellow with no brackets. The C3 is yellow with the brackets. And then there's a prototype C3 with no markings at all. And then C4 is red with no brackets. C5 is red with brackets. So that's the softest compound. So, basically that's what's going on. Bit messy, but I think it gets the point across. Only really relevant this weekend because on normal Grand Prix weekends, they don't bother with this, tyre markings. They just mark them hard, medium, soft, depending on which compounds got selected for that weekend. But very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.